Did you finish the paperwork for the house yet, honey? Susan asked as she moved about the kitchen, her tone light and conversational. William, absorbed in the details of his business deal, looked up from his laptop. Almost done. Just a few more signatures, and it's ours, he said, offering a warm smile. Why? Are you planning something special? Susan's back was turned, but he could see her reflection in the glass window above the sink. Her lips twitched, forming a brief, unreadable smile. Oh, you know me? Always planning something, she replied, her voice almost teasing. William chuckled, distracted by the buzz of an incoming email. Well, don't keep me in suspense, he said, already returning his focus to his work. Susan didn't respond. She poured coffee into 2 cups, stirring one with deliberate slowness. She glanced over her shoulder at William, who was now engrossed in his laptop, completely unaware of the thoughts running through her mind. Later that night, William was in his office, the door slightly ajar. The quiet hum of the house was comforting, a sign of normalcy that he had grown accustomed to. He had almost forgotten about the strange moment in the kitchen when he heard Susan's voice, faint and low. His hand paused over the keyboard, and he leaned back in his chair listening. I'm not scared of my loser husband, Susan's voice carried through the door, dripping with contempt. But I don't want to go to jail. I just want to get rid of him. William's heart began to race. He slowly pushed his chair back, careful not to make a sound, and moved closer to the door. I'll put it in his coffee, and we'll finally be together, she continued, her tone filled with a sinister glee. All his money will be mine. We'll be fucking rich. William felt like the ground had dropped out from beneath him. He gripped the edge of the door frame to steady himself, his mind reeling. Susan, the woman he had loved for years, was plotting to kill him. And not just kill him. She was planning to do it in cold blood, all for his money. He wanted to burst through the door, confront her right then and there, demand to know how she could betray him like this. But he forced himself to stay silent. His mind raced, processing this shocking revelation. He needed to be smart, not rash. As he stood there, he could hear Susan's voice again, but now it was muffled, as if she was moving further away. He had to think. He had to act fast, but he needed a plan. Susan thought she had everything figured out, but she had underestimated him. William took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't afford to let her see that he knew. Not yet. He needed to find out everything. Who she was talking to, how far this plot went. His heart still pounded in his chest, but now it was driven by something other than fear. It was fueled by a deep, burning rage. He wasn't going to be her victim. No, this wasn't going to end the way she had planned. As he walked back to his desk, William's mind was already working out the details. He had always been a strategist, and now his life depended on it. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also given him clarity. He would turn the tables on Susan, and she wouldn't see it coming. He sat down, his hands shaking slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. But instead of returning to his work, he opened a new document, beginning to outline his own plan. This wasn't just about survival. It was about revenge, and William was determined to make sure it was executed flawlessly. Hours passed. William sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He needed to stay calm, but his heart was pounding. Every glance at Susan sent a wave of disgust through him. How long had she been planning this? And with his own brother? The doorbell rang, breaking his chain of thoughts. I'll get it, Susan said with a cheerfulness that made William's skin crawl. She moved toward the door with a spring in her step that seemed almost too casual, too rehearsed. William watched her, his eyes narrowing. He could feel the tension in the room, but Susan seemed completely unaware, or worse, she was ignoring it. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. When Susan opened the door, William's heart nearly stopped. Standing there, with that familiar, easy smile, was his younger brother, David. Hey, big bro, David greeted, stepping inside without hesitation. His eyes flicked to Susan, and there it was, a brief, almost possessive glance that sent a fresh wave of fury through William. Thought I'd stop by and check on you, David continued, his tone too casual, too practiced. I brought some donuts. How about some coffee to go with it? Susan's smile widened, and she exchanged a knowing look with David that made William's blood boil. I'll make it, she said, heading toward the kitchen with a deliberate sway in her hips, her voice saccharine sweet. William forced a smile, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. He watched Susan as she moved with deliberate grace, pulling out the coffee pot. He noticed how her hands were steady as she prepared the coffee. Was this just another part of her plan? She was far too composed for someone who was about to commit murder. They sat down at the table, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Susan placed the steaming cups of coffee in front of them, her smile never wavering. Here you go, boys. Drink up, she said, her eyes glinting with a hidden secret. David took a sip without hesitation, a contented sigh escaping his lips as he savored the flavor. William watched him closely, every fiber of his being wanting to scream at his brother to stop. But he didn't. Instead, William placed his cup back on the table, untouched. Not in the mood for coffee today, William? Susan asked, her voice laced with fake concern, her eyes sharp as they studied him. William smiled, slow and deliberate, feeling a dark satisfaction rise within him. Actually, he said, his voice calm but edged with menace, I think I've had a change of heart. Susan's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of unease crossing her face. David looked up, confusion clouding his features. What do you mean? He asked, glancing between William and Susan. William leaned forward, his eyes locked on David's. You know, David, I've been thinking a lot lately about family, loyalty, and trust, he began, his voice cold and measured. And it occurred to me that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you need to watch the most. Susan's hand trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. The color drained from her face as she realized the shift in William's demeanor. William, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice betraying the first signs of fear. William ignored her, his focus solely on David. You see, David, I've always looked out for you, haven't I? He continued, his tone hardening. But now I realize that loyalty doesn't go both ways in this family. David's eyes widened in shock, his confusion quickly turning to dread as the implications of William's words sank in. William, you've got it all wrong, he started, his voice shaking. Oh, I don't think I do, William interrupted, his voice icy and final. But don't worry, I'm not here to play the victim. In fact, I think it's time we all had a little taste of our own medicine. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of William's words hanging in the air. For the first time, Susan and David realized that William was not the oblivious husband or the doting brother they had thought he was. He was something much more dangerous, a man pushed to the brink, ready to fight back. Susan and David exchanged panicked glances, their faces pale, as William slowly walked over to the kitchen counter. Every step he took felt like a ticking clock, counting down to their doom. He reached into a drawer and, with a deliberate slowness, pulled out a small vial, the same vial Susan had planned to use on him. You were going to poison me, weren't you, Susan? William said, holding up the vial between his fingers. His voice was eerily calm, betraying the storm of emotions roiling beneath the surface. Mix this into my coffee and wait for me to die so you could run off with my brother and my money. Susan's face contorted in terror, her breath catching in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was trapped, and she knew it. William, please, you don't understand, Susan began, her voice trembling, but William's icy stare silenced her instantly. Oh, I understand perfectly, William replied, his tone sharp as a blade. What you don't understand is that I'm not as stupid as you think. You've underestimated me, Susan. He turned his gaze to David, who was visibly shaking. And you, David, my own brother. How long has this been going on? How long have you been sneaking around with her behind my back? David's lips quivered as he tried to speak, but only disjointed sounds came out. The guilt and fear were plain on his face, and for a moment, he looked like a cornered animal. William let out a bitter, humorless laugh. You two really thought you could get away with this, didn't you? You thought you could play me for a fool and walk away without consequences. Before either of them could react, William moved with swift precision, grabbing their cups from the table and swapping them with the one in his hand. You wanted me to drink this poison so badly, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. So why don't you try it yourselves? Susan's eyes widened in horror, and she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "William, no, please," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper, her body trembling. "Drink it," William commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. His eyes were hard, unyielding, as he stared them down. "Both of you, now!" David looked at Susan, his fear mirroring hers, but there was no escape. William's gaze was like a vice, squeezing any hope of defiance out of them. With shaking hands, they each picked up their cups, the liquid inside suddenly feeling like a death sentence. Tears welled up in Susan's eyes, streaming down her cheeks as she realized that she had lost control. There was no way out, no more tricks left to play. The weight of her betrayal hung heavy in the air, suffocating. "Do it!" William roared, his voice erupting with the fury he had kept bottled up for so long. The sound was raw, primal, and it made them both flinch. The room fell into a tense silence as Susan and David shared one last, desperate glance. There was no more time, no more words to be said. Slowly, with the inevitability of the condemned, they raised their cups to their lips. William watched, his face a mask of cold determination, as they swallowed the contents. Every movement felt slow and agonizing, the final act of a tragic play they had written themselves. William stood motionless as Susan and David collapsed to the floor, their bodies convulsing as the poison took hold. The room was filled with the sounds of their gasps, their frantic attempts to draw breath, and the growing horror in their eyes. For a moment, William just watched, his mind numb, as he realized the finality of what he had done. The taste of victory was bitter, mingled with the deep sorrow that began to seep into his chest. Susan's eyes, once filled with cold calculation, now reflected only disbelief and regret. She struggled to focus on William, her trembling hand reaching out toward him. Her voice, now weak and fading, barely escaped her lips. "Why, William? Why'd it have to be like this?" William knelt down beside her, his face softening, the rage that had fueled him beginning to wane. "Because you left me no choice, Susan," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You betrayed me in the worst possible way." Susan's hand, so close to touching him, fell limply to the floor. Her breath slowed, and within moments she was gone. William watched the life drain from her eyes, and for a brief second he felt the weight of his actions press down on him like a heavy shroud. He had loved her once, deeply, and now she was gone by his hand. He stood up slowly, turning his gaze to David, who was still alive, though just barely. David's face was a mask of agony and regret. He tried to speak, his voice choked with tears. "I'm sorry, William. I'm so sorry." William's expression hardened again, the sorrow in his heart clashing with the sense of betrayal that still burned within him. He took a step closer to his brother, looking down at the man who had once been his closest ally, his family. "You should have known better, David," William said, his voice low and steady. "Family means everything to me, but you threw it all away for her." David's eyes, filled with tears, met William's, and for a moment there was a shared understanding between them, a recognition of what had been lost and what could never be regained. But the poison was relentless. David's breath grew more labored, his body shuddering as he fought against the inevitable. William knelt beside him, feeling a strange mixture of anger and pity. He wanted to hate David, to despise him for his betrayal, but as he watched the life slip away from his brother's eyes, all he could feel was an overwhelming sense of loss. "I'm sorry too, David," William whispered, but his words came too late. David's eyes glazed over, his body finally succumbing to the poison. He was gone, leaving William alone in the silence that followed. William stood up, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had done. The house, once filled with life, was now eerily quiet, save for the echoes of the final moments that had just passed. He had won. He had avenged the betrayal that had torn his world apart. But as he stood there, surrounded by the stillness, he realized that he had lost something far greater. He turned away from the bodies of his wife and brother, the emptiness inside him growing with each step. Hours later, William sat alone in his living room, the events of the day swirling in his mind. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. He knew the police would arrive soon, but the thought didn't stir any fear or panic in him. There was a strange calmness in the air, as if the storm had finally passed. The living room was dimly lit, the shadows lengthening as the day turned into evening. William's gaze was fixed on nothing in particular, lost in the void of his thoughts. He had done what he believed was necessary, what he had to do to protect himself. Regret was a foreign concept now, replaced by a numb acceptance of the consequences. The stillness was interrupted by the soft creak of the front door opening. William's eyes shifted toward the sound, and he saw his mother stepping inside. Her movements were slow, hesitant, as if she were stepping into a nightmare. Her eyes immediately fell on the bodies of Susan and David, lying lifeless on the floor. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. "William," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. She had known something was wrong, but seeing it with her own eyes was a shock she wasn't prepared for. William met her gaze, his face devoid of emotion. "Mom, it had to be done," he said quietly, his voice flat. "They were going to kill me." His mother's expression crumpled with grief, but she nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of his words. "I know, William," she murmured, her voice thick with tears. She stepped closer, her eyes not leaving the tragic scene before her. "I knew what they were planning, but I didn't know how to stop it." William's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You knew?" he asked, his voice tinged with shock. His mother nodded, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "I overheard them talking," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to believe it, but when I heard them, I knew I couldn't let them hurt you. I was going to tell you, but—" William leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. "But what?" he pressed, needing to understand. She sighed heavily, wiping at the tears that streaked her cheeks. "I was too late," she admitted, her voice filled with regret. "By the time I made up my mind, you had already found out." William's head fell into his hands, the full weight of everything crashing down on him. The betrayal, the violence, the loss, it all became too much to bear. "I didn't want it to end like this, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know, son," she said softly, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The warmth of her touch was a small comfort in the cold, unforgiving reality of what had transpired. But sometimes we're forced to do things we never thought we were capable of. They sat together in the silence, the minutes stretching on as they waited for the inevitable arrival of the authorities. William's mind raced with thoughts of what his life had become. The house that once symbolized his hard-earned success now felt like a tomb, filled with the echoes of decisions that could never be undone. As his mother sat beside him, her hand still on his shoulder, William realized the depth of his isolation. The betrayal had not just taken his wife and brother from him. It had stripped away his peace of mind, his sense of safety, and his belief in the goodness of those closest to him. "Do you think they'll understand?" William asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure who he meant, the police, the world, or perhaps even himself. His mother took a deep breath, her own pain evident in the tightness of her grip. "I don't know, William," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I do know that you did what you thought you had to. And sometimes, that's all we can do." William nodded, though the reassurance did little to lift the weight on his heart. The truth was, he didn't need the understanding of others. He needed to understand himself, to come to terms with the man he had become. The sound of distant sirens began to fill the air, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. William knew they were coming for him, and with them would come questions, investigations, and judgments. He didn't flinch at the thought. Instead, he simply closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he looked at his mother, seeing the pain etched into her face. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pulled him into a tight embrace. "No, William. I'm the one who's sorry. I should have told you sooner. I should have done something." William returned her embrace, feeling the tears sting his own eyes. "It's too late for that now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we'll get through this." Somehow, as the sirens blared just outside, William and his mother held onto each other, finding solace in the only thing they had left, their bond. The front door burst open moments later, and the room was flooded with flashing lights and the heavy footsteps of law enforcement. But William didn't resist. He let them take him, knowing that whatever lay ahead, it couldn't be worse than the betrayal that had already destroyed his life. As he was led away, he looked back at his mother one last time, her tear-streaked face the last anchor to a world that had been ripped apart. In that moment, William understood the true cost of survival. He had lost everything, his family, his future, and even a part of himself. But in the ruins of his old life, he found a cold, bitter clarity. Betrayal has a price, and sometimes the cost is more than you ever imagined paying. The wail of sirens shattered the stillness of the night, growing louder as they neared William's house. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting a staccato of light and shadow on the walls. Inside, William sat on the couch, his posture rigid and his expression empty. Beside him, his mother sat in stunned silence, her face pale and etched with worry. Both knew that the arrival of the police was just the beginning of a long, grueling ordeal. The front door was flung open, and uniformed officers burst into the house, their movements swift and purposeful. "Put your hands where we can see them," one officer commanded, his voice authoritative and sharp. William slowly raised his hands, his gaze steady. "I'm not resisting. I'll cooperate." An officer approached and efficiently cuffed William's hands behind his back. Another officer began to secure the area, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. The bodies of Susan and David lay on the floor, the overturned coffee cups and spilled contents painting a grim picture. Two victims, both deceased, an officer reported into his radio. "Possible poisoning. We need forensics and a coroner on site immediately." The lead detective, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor named Detective Reynolds, stepped into the room. His eyes swept over the chaotic scene before settling on William. "You must be William," Reynolds said, his voice measured but probing. "Can you tell me what happened here?" William looked up at Reynolds, his face impassive. "I will. But first, I want to speak with my lawyer." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say could be used against you, so it's in your best interest to speak with legal counsel before making any statements." William's gaze didn't waver. "I understand. I'll explain everything once I have my lawyer present." Reynolds considered him for a moment, then motioned to the officers. "Take him to the station. Handle him carefully. We need to make sure all details are accurately reported." As the officers escorted William from the house, his mother watched, her eyes filled with tears. "William," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of activity. William glanced back, offering a small, reassuring nod. He couldn't find the words to comfort her, but he hoped his gesture would convey that he was still in control, even if the situation was spiraling out of control. Outside, the cool night air hit William's face as he was led to the waiting squad car. The flashing lights of the police vehicles illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the driveway. The officers placed him in the back seat of the squad car and closed the door, shutting him off from the world outside. As the car pulled away from the house, William looked out the window, his thoughts racing. He had hoped for a resolution that would bring clarity and closure, but now he faced a legal and emotional labyrinth. The truth about what had happened that night was complicated and painful, and he knew that navigating through it would be far from straightforward. Back at the house, Detective Reynolds and his team continued their investigation. Reynolds began questioning the remaining witnesses, including William's mother, who was struggling to keep herself composed. Her answers were fragmented, and her grief was palpable, but she managed to convey the most crucial details. As the police worked, William sat in the back of the squad car, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on him. He had taken extreme measures, but now he was left to face the consequences. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The journey through the aftermath of his decisions was just beginning. The interrogation room was stark and uninviting, with bright fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glow. William sat alone at a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. Detective Reynolds, seated across from him, kept his eyes locked on William, his demeanor professional but scrutinizing. "All right, William," Reynolds began, his voice calm but firm. "You asked for a lawyer, and one's on the way. But before we get to that, I need you to help me understand what happened tonight." William shifted in his chair, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists. "I overheard my wife on the phone last night," he started, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "She was planning to kill me. She was going to poison me, and she was working with my brother to do it." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "That's quite a serious accusation. What makes you so sure?" "I heard them clearly," William replied, leaning forward slightly. "She was talking about putting something in my coffee. When David came over today, she made us both coffee. I knew something was wrong. I just knew." Reynolds jotted a few notes, then looked up. "So you switched the cups?" William nodded. "Yes. I didn't want to wait and find out what would happen. I wanted them to know that I wasn't going to be their victim." "And then they both?" Reynolds asked, letting the question trail off. "They both drank it," William said, his voice flat. "They realized what I had done too late." Reynolds closed the file with a sigh. "William, this is a complicated case. You're claiming self-defense, but poisoning isn't exactly a spur-of-the-moment act. It involves planning and intent." William's gaze fell to his hands, the weight of the metal cuffs a constant reminder of his predicament. "I didn't see any other way out," he said quietly. "They were going to kill me. If I hadn't acted, I'd be dead right now." Reynolds studied him, then leaned back in his chair. "The law doesn't always align with our personal sense of justice. This case is going to be messy, no matter what." A knock on the door interrupted them. Reynolds glanced at the clock and then back at William. "Your lawyer is here," he said. "We'll pause for now." William's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor named Sam Brooks, entered the room. He offered William a reassuring nod before taking a seat next to him. "William, we'll get through this," Brooks said, placing a hand on William's shoulder. "Let's hear what Detective Reynolds has to say." Reynolds briefed Brooks on the basics of the case, while William sat quietly, absorbing the information. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. He was facing charges, and his actions would be scrutinized in a way he had never imagined. As Reynolds wrapped up his summary, he stood up, signaling that the formal questioning was over for now. "William, we'll proceed with the investigation. I'll be in touch. Remember, anything you say can still be used in the case." William nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand." As Reynolds left the room, Brooks turned to William. "We need to be prepared for a long road ahead. The details you've given us are important, but we'll need to build a strong case to explain your actions." William took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders. "I just want the truth to come out," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of determination and apprehension. Brooks nodded. "We'll make sure that happens. For now, let's focus on getting you through this." As the door closed behind Detective Reynolds and Brooks, William sat back in his chair, the weight of his decisions heavy on his mind. The immediate danger was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. The path to clearing his name was uncertain and fraught with obstacles, but he was prepared to face whatever came next. The courtroom was filled with a low hum of conversation as spectators filled the seats, eagerly awaiting the trial of William. His case had captivated the town, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The dramatic events of betrayal and revenge had become a sensation, and everyone was keen to see how justice would unfold. William sat at the defense table, flanked by his lawyer, Sam Brooks. Across from them, the prosecution prepared their case, intent on portraying William as a man who had premeditated the murders of his wife and brother. They argued that William had taken the law into his own hands, and their aim was to depict him as calculating and vengeful. Brooks reviewed his notes and whispered to William, "We need to stay focused. The jury needs to understand the threat you faced and the emotional turmoil you were under." The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution presented their case first, painting a picture of William as a man who, despite having options, chose violence. They argued that William could have sought help or confronted his wife, but instead opted for murder. Next, Brooks delivered the defense's opening statement, emphasizing William's fear for his life. He outlined the betrayal William had suffered and the imminent danger he faced. William didn't act out of malice, Brooks argued. He acted to save his own life from a premeditated threat. Witnesses were called, starting with William's mother. Her testimony was heart-wrenching. She described discovering the affair and overhearing the plan to poison William. Her voice cracked as she recounted her efforts to warn her son, highlighting the emotional strain and fear she experienced. The prosecution countered by questioning William's choices. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" they asked. "Why didn't you confront your wife directly?" William's response was calm but strained. "I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified. I acted on instinct." The courtroom grew tense as the trial progressed. William's fate rested in the jury's hands. Each argument and testimony seemed to weigh heavily on him, and he sat in silence, feeling the gravity of his decisions. The jury's decision was imminent, and William could only hope that they would understand the desperation and fear that had driven his actions. After several tense days of deliberation, the jury finally returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. William sat at the defense table, his heart pounding as he gripped the edge of the table. His mother sat beside him, her hand clutching his, her face a mixture of hope and fear. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman stood up, holding the verdict in his hands. He cleared his throat, and William's gaze fixed on him. "We, the jury, find the defendant, William Carter, not guilty of first-degree murder." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. William's breath caught in his throat, and he squeezed his mother's hand. The initial rush of relief was palpable, but the foreman continued. "However, we do find the defendant guilty of involuntary manslaughter." William's shoulders slumped. He had hoped for complete acquittal, but he understood the implications. Involuntary manslaughter meant he wouldn't face a life sentence, but it was still a conviction that would lead to prison time. The judge stood and addressed the court. "William Carter, I hereby sentence you to 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years." William took a deep breath. It was a compromise, a sentence he could manage, but not what he had hoped for. As he was led away in handcuffs, he glanced back at his mother. She was sobbing quietly, her tears reflecting the heartbreak and relief intertwined in her expression. "I'll be okay, Mom," William said, his voice steady despite the situation. "I'll get through this." His mother nodded, trying to compose herself. "I'll be here when you get out, William. I promise." William was escorted out of the courtroom, his thoughts racing. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to face it with resilience. As he walked down the hallway, he focused on the promise he had made to his mother and to himself: to endure, to grow, and to emerge from this ordeal stronger. The prison walls loomed high, a constant reminder of William's past and the reality he had to face. Each day began with a routine: the clanging of metal gates, the monotonous calls of the guards, and the steady rhythm of footsteps on concrete. William's days were spent in the prison library, a place that had become his sanctuary. Surrounded by stacks of legal texts and case files, he found solace in the orderly chaos of books and the act of helping other inmates navigate their legal battles. William's initial anger and bitterness gradually softened as he immersed himself in his new role. His work in the library gave him purpose and a sense of control that he had lacked since his arrest. He helped other inmates draft petitions, review case law, and understand their rights. Through these interactions, he learned more about the justice system and the power of knowledge, transforming his anger into a determination to improve himself and contribute positively, even from behind bars. The day of his parole arrived, and William's heart pounded with anticipation. The prison gates opened, and he stepped out, feeling the cool air on his face for the first time in years. His mother stood waiting, her eyes red and glistening with tears of joy. As he approached, she threw her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Welcome home, William," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. William hugged her back, his own eyes moistening. "It's good to be home, Mom," he said softly. The weight of the past 5 years seemed to lift as he felt the warmth of her embrace. They walked to the car, William carrying only a few personal belongings, a stark contrast to the life he had once known. As they drove away from the prison, William looked out the window, taking in a landscape that had changed so much during his incarceration. The world outside seemed different, and he too had changed. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined him. His mother reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "We'll get through this together, William," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. William turned to her, offering a small, grateful smile. "Yes, we will." The car drove along the highway, the prison growing smaller in the distance. William looked back one last time, not with regret, but with a sense of closure. He had faced the shadows of his past and was ready to embrace the uncertain future. The road ahead was unfamiliar and filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. As they continued their journey, William felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was determined to rebuild his life, honor the lessons learned, and live with integrity. The future was unwritten, but William was ready to face it with resilience, supported by the unwavering love of his mother and his own inner strength. The promise of a new beginning lay ahead, and William was prepared to embrace it fully.